slash GitHub. We have a route to render something. We'll go to slash GitHub. But we're probably going to need something a bit more complex than just an H1 that says GitHub. Probably should make its own component, right? Let's make a component. We've done that a bunch of times. Make a new file in your source directory. We'll call it github.js. Make it a component. What's the first thing I need? Import React. Importing. Second thing I need. The actual component. Third thing I need. Export statement. And our component needs what? A render. For right now, just to make sure it works, we'll have it say something different so we're sure we're using the component. We'll just have it return a simple H1. And then, once you have that, back in app.js, instead of a render, we're going to get rid of that. Now that we have a component, we're just going to tell it what component to render. But before I can use this component, what do I need to do? Import it. You guys are so good at this stuff. It's almost like you learned something in the last 2.5 weeks. I know, I don't believe it either.
Yeah, I doubt it.
Oh, hooray! GitHub component. We did it. So, we know we got the component wired up correctly. What do we actually want it to look like? Well, it looks like we should have a GitHub logo, and then we should have a form with a button, and then below that, if we haven't entered a username, we want to show this, right? So let's start with this part. Let's make our GitHub component look like this part. So instead of an H1, let's get rid of that. Let's do a wrapping div. And let's see, what did I call that class? I'll just give it a class of GitHub. Lowercase g GitHub. And then we know we have an image, right? For the GitHub logo. And the source for that, I'll just go ahead and give you that. In Slack. And I'm going to break this onto different lines so it's easier to see. And then, as always, on an image, we'll put our alt tag in. Got an image. Also need that form, right? And we got a div in there with an input of type text. And then another div with a submit button, right? that button says look up GitHub user. So, image of the GitHub logo, a form with a text input, and a submit button. Easy enough. And it looks real nice. Got a giant GitHub logo and a tiny input. Let's get some styling on that. Make it look a little more reasonable. Raisonnable. The rules are in Slack. We are going to make a CSS file for our component. GitHub.css. I can paste those rules in there. And make sure they actually are used, so we'll import them into the GitHub component. Much better. Sweet.
So like on the input, I'm making something else myself, and I was trying to get the input to be centered on the screen. Is everything centered because you've centered the app?
No, not in this case. So the rules that do that are, so our div that wraps the whole component, this .github div, is a width of 80%. And margin 0 auto, so that means margin on top and bottom is 0. On the sides is auto. So then it's only 80% of the width. I have 20% left over. If I do auto, that means it's going to adjust the left and right margins to make it even. And so that's what pushes it to the middle, because it's only 80% of the container width. Good question, though. So I'm going to do a commit here. Add markup and styling for GitHub component. Yeah, so pretty much for styling stuff, if you like wanting a chunk of stuff centered, then you can wrap it in a div, give the div a width, and then center it with margin 0 auto, and that'll.
My CSS right now is just terrible.
It takes a lot of practice, for sure. Davey and I did a job a while back where we did like CSS for like weeks straight, and that made me get a lot better at it. But it takes time.
Do they have like websites where you can look up?
Oh yeah, for sure. Okay. And some pretty good books and stuff too. But honestly, yeah. That plus like best thing is just eventually you'll have styled enough stuff that you kind of remember how things work. Yeah. And have seen enough rules that you can think of what rule you might want to use, or at least get yourself going in the right direction. Yeah. Cool. So we got that styled up. Let's see. So, as of right now, we've got a pretty thing, right? But I can type stuff in here. But does my component know about that at all? Nope. How do we get it to know about it? Do what? Well, on change would track when we make changes to it. On submit, we could do something with it when it's submitted. How do we keep track? Like, how do we?
You need like a handle submit and keep track of the event.
Mm-hmm. And where do we keep track of stuff in a component? State, right? Yeah, we need some state. So let's initialize some state here. We'll use property initializer. Just say state equals. And what are we tracking? Seems reasonable. And what should the username be when we first load the page? Nothing. Empty string. Null. Whatever you want to make it. And then how do we tie this value to the input? Just say value equals that, right? I'm going to break this onto multiple lines too. You don't have to. I'm just using a very large font size, so it makes it easier for me to read. So we got our value tied to state, as we've seen several times. That's cool. Can't type anything now. Why? Because we didn't give it a way to update the value, right? We just tied it to an empty string. So we need an onChange handler. And when a change occurs, we will call a method that we'll simply call handle change. And handle change is an event handler, right? So it'll receive the event as an argument. And if what we're doing is updating state, what method do we use? Set state. So this is a pretty simple state. We just have the username in here, right? So we're going to update username to be what? Nice. Event.target.value. And just to make sure that's all working, let's go ahead and do our function in the callback and log out this.state. And see if that works. We got our console open. Looks like it. I don't know why I like doing that so much, but it's fun. All right, so we know it works. We can take that back out. Let's commit at that point. Tie value of input to state. All right, so what do we want to have happen? So let's say we've entered a username and I now hit the submit button. What do we want to have happen?
We wanted to have reached out to GitHub to find that input to drag that account back.
Eventually, yes. Eventually, we do want to talk to the GitHub API to get information about this user. But in a much more immediate sense, if I enter a username here, mostly what we're doing is just making the username that we put in go on the URL, right? Which then triggers a different route, which then gets the stuff from GitHub. But in the immediate sense, we just need to make it so when we submit, we adjust the URL to a new location, right? So how are we going to do that? Well, first thing is we're doing it when we submit, right? So we need an onSubmit handler. So on our form, we'll do onSubmit. And we'll just make a handle submit function. And what's the first thing that normally happens on a submit?
Well, you have to prevent the default.
Yeah. We got to prevent default because we don't want it to do its normal thing. And then what we do want it to do is push a new history thing, right? We want to go to a different location. So remember, the three things that we automatically get because we're inside router is match, history, and location. History is the one that keeps track of where we've been. So what we're doing is essentially pushing a new history item onto that. So we'll say this.props.history.push, and then we want to go to, oops. Yeah, so slash GitHub, right? Slash what? The username, right? Which we stored where? Right? So when we submit the form, we're going to prevent default, and then we're going to grab the history object, which we already have on props because we're inside the router. Use the push method and push this slash GitHub slash whatever the username is onto that. So let's see. So we're at slash GitHub. And you can see our URL just updated, right? Now we don't have any more routes that match that, so it doesn't do anything yet, but we've seen that we can take what's here and get it into the URL. Now the one other thing that would be nice, you notice this didn't clear out. That would be kind of nice if it did. How would we do that? Reset it by doing what? What's it tied to?
Is there something you can put on the input that does that?
I mean, we could grab the form itself and call reset on it, but what's the value of the form tied to? State, right? So we could just set it back to an empty string. There we go. So we still get it up here, but it does clear out the form for us. So that's nice. Do a commit there. All right, so again, looking at the finished product, we have this part, so that stays rendered, right? So we're not going to want anything to do with routing that's going to change that. But we do render something different down here. So we kind of have, when we don't have a username, we render this. If we do have anything else past GitHub, then it is going to render something different, which apparently there actually is a user called ITJ. That's nice. So, step one, we want to render this when we have an exact match for slash GitHub, but no other time, right? Anybody remember how we can do that? Switch would work, but we really only have two options. Either it has a username or it doesn't, right? So switch might be overkill in that case.
It was the thing you showed in the presentation. I just don't remember what it was.
Yeah. The thing I showed in the presentation was, we can say exact, right? So we're going to say, when we have an exact match of slash GitHub, render this thing. And not if it's not exact. So, what we are going to do is right below our form, but still inside the main parent div. Let's put in a route. And then we can just say the word exact in there. Man, what is this doing? Exact. And our path is equal to /GitHub, right? So only when the path is exactly /GitHub are you going to render this thing. And we just need to render that one line, so let's just use an inline render. And we'll say, please enter a username to search on GitHub. Oh, make sure you have a closing tag. So has anybody done routing in any other frameworks or anything? No? That's good. This is very different than the way most routers work. Most routers are just like a huge list of paths, and then if you match this one, render this thing. If you match this one, render this thing. That's what we call static rendering. React Router version 4 is different. You can see we just kind of throw in routes wherever we want them. We don't have one file that contains all the routes. You just kind of use them as conditional rendering things. So the good news is you don't have to unlearn static rendering or static routing to do this. So that's good. But at any rate, now we have something that when we exactly match GitHub should just render this H3. And it does, but you can see if I add anything else onto it, that should... Oh, that's the wrong one. Oh, boo. What'd I get? And why did I get it? Didn't import route. Don't forget your imports. All right, so now that we've imported the component we're using, you can see I do not exactly match /GitHub, so I do not see the thing. But when I do exactly match, then I do see the thing. Cool. Now then, so let's add another route for what renders. Yeah, what's the question? So again, because we wrapped app in router, that means all the children of the whole app, so every subcomponent, gets those three props objects automatically: history, match, and location. So like if we go out here and we use our React DevTools, and let's search for our GitHub component, you can see we already have, even though we didn't explicitly pass any props, the router did. So it's got history, which so far has a length of 8 with different things we've been doing here. We've got, and you can see that we have this push method on it. We have got our location, which gives us the path name, any search params that you have in there. And then we've also got this match object, which tells us whether or not what we currently matched on was exact or not. It tells us the path, the URL, and then also the params, which currently is an empty object because we haven't defined any params yet. But we're about to. Nice. So let's do another route. And this time we want it to match when it's /GitHub/ some username, but we don't know what the username is going to be, right? So if it's /GitHub, and then you can use the colon to say this is going to be a param. In this param, I'm going to call username. So whatever I put after /GitHub, you're going to consider that to be a param called username. And then, for right now, we'll eventually make a component, but let's just render something. Now we have not, these anonymous functions, we haven't done anything other than just render some text really. So we haven't needed the props, but they do all get props if you pass them in, that you'll be able to access them inside the function. So in this case we are. So we're going to put in an H3. And let's just have it list who we searched for, what the username was. You searched for. And so we just told it we have a param called username, right? So we can say props.match, which we automatically get from the router, .params.username. So when you match /github/something, assign this something to a param called username, and then I can access that inside my component as props.match.params.whatever I told it the name was. You searched for hello. I sure did. You searched for howdy.
I like it the way it is.
Yeah, that's probably good, right?
We're done.
This is a good place.
That's what's like it.
So does that make sense how we can get information out of the URL using params? More or less? All right. Do a quick commit here. Make route for matching GitHub username.